The term mental illness covers many conditions, from worrying a bit too much about everyday problems to extreme behaviour that can make you a danger to yourself or to others. In the same way, the term psychiatry covers a large range of treatments, from simply talking things over to drastic physical measures affecting the brain or the body. Where the guidelines are so uncertain about what's wrong and what to do about it, there's plenty of room for mistakes. It'd be nice to think that other doctors will always be around to keep an eye on questionable psychiatric practices. But in the case you're about to see, no questions were asked until it was too late. Audrey Francis, dead. Peter Clark, a 31-year-old policeman, dead. A 26-year-old woman, whom we'll call Maria, also dead. They were among at least 7 patients who died after psychiatric treatment in a Sydney private hospital. Peter Clark left 2 children and his wife, Denise.
I just didn't know what to think, you know. It was just like a nightmare. It's still like a nightmare. I mean, it's been 6 years now and I haven't got over it. I don't think I ever will.
Did you want an autopsy? Why not investigation?
Well, I wanted to have the body exhumed. But I went and saw my solicitor and they said to me, you can't fight a doctor.
You can't fight a doctor? So you dropped it?
I dropped it.
The psychiatric treatment is called narcosis. Massive amounts of drugs are given to a patient to put them to sleep for long periods of time. To say that it's controversial is an understatement. This place here, Chelmsford Private Hospital in Sydney, was one of the few places in the world to be using narcosis. And who used it? Dr. John Heron and Dr. Harry Bailey. They were among just a handful of psychiatrists to still be using narcosis in the 1970s.
Oh, Dr. Bailey. It was his room, it was his invention, it was his baby. He really believed in it.
And she should know. Marcia Nast worked at the hospital for 6 years, ending up as the matron.
The patient would be given an injection initially of a barbiturate, and that would just put them to sleep. And we used to do that in the outside of the hospital, like in the ordinary section, because we didn't like to take patients in awake into the sedation ward because it didn't look good for them to see other people, because we put Ryle's tubes down their noses to feed them and that sort of thing, and we thought that, you know, that sometimes could freak people out.
Barry Hart was certainly freaked out by Chelmsford. At the time, Mr. Hart, a 33-year-old Sydney businessman, was suffering from depression. Dr. Heron persuaded him to go to Chelmsford Hospital.
I followed this nurse down this corridor and walked into this ward, and she put into a bed and she said, wait here, and then she disappeared. So I'm sitting there and I'm looking around, and in the next bed next to me was a guy who had all his head shaved, had all scars over his scalp, you know. And I thought, it freaked me out. I thought, God, what's this place? And I looked around, there was another guy, he looked like he was drugged. He was all, you know, not quite with it. Some time went past and I thought, you know, where's Dr. Heron? Is he going to turn up at night? So then I decided I wasn't going to stay. And I said to a female nurse, I said, look, I'm not staying, I'm going. And she said, do you feel nervous? And I said, yes, you know. Naturally, I thought, God, what's this place? And she disappeared and she came back and she had like a glass of water and a tablet or something, you know. And she said, take this, it'll settle you down. Next thing I can remember, everything went black.
Remember, at least 7 people went into this hospital and died during or shortly after narcosis treatment. And we're talking about a very brief period of time, between 1974 and 1977. And the narcosis treatment was also used with another highly controversial form of treatment, ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, better known as shock treatment.
There's a lot of people knew about that Chelmsford Hospital, what was going on there.
Barry Hart, like other patients at Chelmsford, was subjected to shock treatment combined with narcosis. Apart from the 7 deaths, there were a number who suffered serious physical complications, including paralysis and brain damage. Mr. Hart himself was left with brain damage. But unlike the others, he wasn't willing to let the matter drop. He took legal action.
I was on myself, but I couldn't feel my body. It's a horrible feeling. And all my head inside was exploding with white light. It was blowing off its shoulders. And then oblivion, everything went Then the next thing I remember, I woke up and I had a tube up my nose. I had these tremendous pains in my shoulders. And I tried to alleviate the pain by moving my arms around, and I couldn't do it because my arms were strapped. I went berserk, you know. I yelled out, get these things off, and I heard people running and noises and people talking, and then nothing again. I had these tremendous pains in my chest. It was like agony. To breathe, it was like someone stick a knife and twisting it. It was so painful. And I complained about this, and he said, oh, that will go away and clear up. And it didn't. It got worse, and I used to vomit, and I used to vomit up blood, and one of the nurses said to me, she said, look, if I was you, I'd get out of here. She said, you know,
Hang on, a nurse in the hospital said
yes, a nurse in the hospital said, if I was you, I'd get out of here. You're sick, you know. You won't get treated for what's wrong with you in here.
Now, all this happened to Barry Hart 7 years ago, back in 1973. What took so long?
Well, first of all, hassles I had with the legal profession, the solicitors. I had 5 solicitors before I got the present ones, you know.
What do you mean hassles?
People think it's like something from a film script, or you've made it up, already you've been in a psychiatric hospital and say, well, you know, why were you in the psychiatric hospital in the first place? There must be something wrong with you, otherwise, you know, and who's going to believe you? Who's going to believe an ex-psychiatric patient?
Now, what you're about to see are parts of Barry Hart's court case, and they are taken from the court records.
Overruled. The question is allowed. Yes, there is. Objection. Overruled.
In this reenactment, we're using actors to play the role of the key characters. Mr. Ted St. John, QC, the barrister representing Barry Hart. Dr. John Sidney Smith, an Australian psychiatrist, called in as an expert witness by Barry Hart. Tom Hughes, QC, representing both Dr. Heron and the Chelmsford Hospital. And again, an actor taking the role of Dr. John Heron, the doctor being sued.
Do you understand what is meant by deep sedation, sleep therapy, narcosis?
Yes, I do.
And are those terms more or less interchangeable?
More or less.
Is there any danger associated with that class of treatment?
Yes, there is. Objection. Overruled. The question is allowed.
What is the danger, or dangers?
There is the danger of death, and that is a significant danger. I object, Your Honour. Overruled.
Remember, deep narcosis, deep sedation, sleep therapy, whatever it's called, is brought about by giving the patients massive amounts of drugs. And at Chelmsford, the patients were given powerful dosages for 10, 12, even 14 days.
Bearing in mind your professional estimate of the range and the cumulative effect of the drugs, what would you say about a prescription of this size? Is it low or high or in between, or what is it?
It's dangerous and potentially fatal.
Dangerous and potentially fatal. So where did this idea come from, the idea of putting psychiatric patients into deep sleep? One of the pioneers was a British psychiatrist by the name of Dr. William Sargent. And even Dr. Sargent acknowledged that there were risks involved. He laid down some strict safety rules. And the Australian expert Dr. John Smith was asked about those rules.
Was there a range of precautions that were taken in relation to this treatment to ensure the safety of the patient?
Yes.
What were they?
That the drug should be spaced so that the patient was awake and capable of eating at his bedside.
Dr. Smith went on to list 6 precautions, from making sure that the patient was able to walk around, that he could be easily woken up, and most important, to stop the treatment immediately if certain complications set in.
And the presence of a respiratory complication such as pneumonia would call for an immediate cessation of treatment.
As we said, Chelmsford Hospital appears to be the only hospital in Australia that was using this deep narcosis. And Dr. Heron and his colleague Dr. Harry Bailey were among the few psychiatrists in the world to be using it. Now, Dr. Heron was Barry Hart's doctor, so he was the one being sued, and he was the one who would be called upon to answer this issue of danger.
You were aware, of course, that there were risks attached to sleep treatment, weren't you?
Yes?
Even at the risk of incurring death in some cases?
Yes.
So that you were undertaking something which did have grave risks attached to it, right?
Yes?
So Dr. Heron himself agrees that there were grave risks involved. So what happened to those safety precautions that were laid down by the British expert, Dr. William Sargent?
Did you, in fact, depart from the precautions as laid down by Dr. Sargent?
There was some variation between our practice and his practice.
And this was a very considerable and significant variation.
It was not a considerable variation.
But Mr. St. John was not to be satisfied with that answer. And in intensive cross-examination, he was to win a significant admission that out of 6 safety precautions, 5 had been ignored by Dr. Heron in his practice at Chelmsford.
You have conceded that in greater or less degree, you declined to accept 5 out of the 6 precautions recommended by Dr. Sargent. That's true, isn't it?
I have agreed with that.
And you knew that Dr. Bailey's practice was similar in that regard, didn't you?
I would believe that Dr. Bailey's practice would be similar in that regard.
We knew that there were risk factors like respiratory problems like pneumonia, bronchitis, and deep venous thrombosis was also a problem.
Even though these people would come in physically healthy. Barry Hart won his historic court case. He got $60,000 in compensation. But what about the patients who didn't survive? Macquarie Street is the home of Sydney's top medical specialists. And this is where Dr. Bailey and Dr. Heron have their rooms. Patients were told that they were going to Chelmsford Hospital just for a rest. But we can't find anyone who was warned beforehand of the dangers of the treatment that they'd get at Chelmsford. As we mentioned earlier, Peter Clark, the police constable, was one of those who died at Chelmsford. Peter Clark had been an active policeman for 12 years. A fitness fanatic, he was the New South Wales Open Wrestling champion. But in 1974, Clark was in a severe state of anxiety, and Dr. Bailey put him into Chelmsford.
He was admitted on the Monday about, say, 11:30. He died the Friday night about 10:15. And during that week, I rang up every day and asked could I come up to see him, and it was always no.
Why not?
They wouldn't tell me.
What were the circumstances of his death? I mean, how were you informed that he was dead?
Dr. Bailey rang me up at my mother and father's place where I was staying, and they said, Dr. Bailey spoke to me. He said, I'm sorry, Peter just died. And I said, died? I said, what of? And he said, a heart attack. And I said, you must be joking. He said, I'm not joking. I said, but he was only 31. I said, why didn't you check him? He said, I worked on him for half an hour, tried to revive him. He said, I couldn't.
Audrey Francis was just over 60. She was still an active journalist when she went into Chelmsford and died.
When she went into Chelmsford, she was 100% because she'd just been a week in Ryde District Hospital and after a fall, and they had tested every organ of her body, everything.
Although it was 1976, Audrey's sister Vera remembers it clearly. Now, how long was she in hospital at Chelmsford before she died?
42 hours.
How many?
42 hours.
Less than 2 days.
Yes.
The death of Audrey Francis was to be brought up in Barry Hart's court case. It was suggested that Dr. Heron tried to avoid an inquest, and that the inquest was only held because of the insistence of Vera Francis and Audrey's son. But it went further than that. This is a copy of the letter which Dr. Heron sent to the inquest, explaining Audrey Francis's death. A close look shows that there is an alteration on the important detail about body temperature. Now, to Dr. Heron, that alteration was merely a mistake. But to Mr. St. John, it revealed an attempt to mislead the inquest.
Between 7 and 8, the phone rang, and I went to the phone, and a voice said, "This is Chelmsford Hospital." I said, "Yes. Your sister passed away at 20 minutes past 2 this morning. Her body has been taken to a certain funeral parlour, which they named, and I'll give you the phone number so you can ring to make the funeral arrangements." I said, "What are you telling me?" Well, she died. I said, "Well, can I speak to Dr. Heron?" "Oh, he's not here." So I said, "Well, where can I get him?" "Oh, you might be able to get him at North Ryde Psychiatric Hospital. Haven't got his home number. He'll be ringing you later." He never did.
There was also the case of the 26-year-old Italian woman. We'll call her Maria. That's not her real name. The fact is, some families who lost loved ones at Chelmsford don't want to revive that memory now. They simply don't want to get involved. But Maria was, in a sense, a woman caught between the two cultures, the Australian and the Italian culture. She was suffering from depression. So Dr. Harry Bailey put her in Chelmsford. These are Maria's medical records. This is a report that we had done by two specialists who analysed the medical records. According to the report, Maria was apparently depressed, but she was physically fit. But within 4 hours of the sedation commencing, Maria was found to be seriously ill. And the specialist report says that in the first 8 days, Maria was suffering 3 major problems: pneumonia, damage to the kidneys, and hemorrhage from the bowel. Yet in spite of Maria being seriously ill, our specialist report found there is no indication that any measures were taken to investigate or to treat the internal bleeding. And finally, the records show, although Maria was seriously ill, for at least 11 days, a deep level of sedation was maintained, during which she received 8 electroconvulsive therapy treatments. That's 8 electric shock treatments, much the same as in this British documentary film.
Nice and relaxed.
This was done to Maria many times, even though she was seriously ill.
What is the danger of giving ECT when a patient is seriously ill?
Well, the major danger would be that you could kill the patient.
26-year-old Maria died at Chelmsford Hospital. There was no inquest, no investigation. Dr. Richard Ball is the president of the Royal Australian College of Psychiatrists. Both Dr. Heron and Dr. Bailey are members of the college. That organisation is the ethical watchdog for the profession. Despite the deaths, despite Mr. Hart's much publicised court case, that watchdog has failed to bark.
The system works insofar as we require complaints upon which we can act.
Who then rings the alarm bells? If there is a problem, if there's a danger, if there's reason for concern, who rings the alarm bells?
If the situation were such as you describe in regard to any kind of treatment, this may be from professional colleagues.
Have you had complaints about this from colleagues?
No.
Our evidence is at least one psychiatrist complained in writing to the college about the practice at that hospital.
I have not, as federal president, had this matter brought to my attention in the way that you suggest. This does not mean that it has not been brought to the branch level and will in due course come to us.
The letter was written 2 years ago.
I'm not aware of that letter.
And yet the college is in the business of self-regulation, isn't it? Isn't that part of your job?
That is correct.
Dr. Ball rang us the day after this interview and confirmed that a letter of complaint had indeed been received 2 years ago, not by his office of the college, but in the Sydney branch. I'm not a professional, you're the professional, but I'm surprised, as the families, mothers, fathers, sisters, families of people we've spoken to, were surprised that their daughter or their son left home in a physical condition that was fine, suffering from depression, and within a couple of days or a couple of weeks, died.
I think it's unusual, very unusual.
That's as strong as Dr. Ball would put it. On the record, he refused to make any specific comments about the activities of Dr. Heron or Dr. Bailey, and so did every other Australian psychiatrist we contacted. So we came here to Syracuse, New York. American professionals seem to be a lot less secretive about these things. We came to this man, Dr. Thomas Suss. He's been professor of psychiatry here for more than 25 years.
The medical profession has always preached and practiced that the doctor's first loyalty is to his colleagues, and only after that to his patients. And George Bernard Shaw said it this way: every profession is a conspiracy against the public. Now, this is changing somewhat for the better.
we gave Professor Suss a number of Chelmsford case histories to analyse, including Maria's. Remember, Maria was the 26-year-old Italian woman who had been subjected to both narcosis and shock treatment, even though the hospital records show clearly she was seriously ill.
Well, I have seen and heard of plenty of horror stories, but this is one of the worst. Now, narcosis has been disqualified as a treatment for at least 20 years.
In the United States?
Not only in the United States, I checked the leading British textbook of psychiatry, Henderson and Gillespie's textbook of psychiatry, 10th edition. This was published in 1969. So this is already 11 years old now. Now let me read to you what it says about narcosis treatment. I quote, "One can see now no indication for its use in the affective psychoses." By affective psychosis, the authors mean depression, typically exactly the sort of condition that Maria had. They conclude the last sentence of their statement on narcosis reads as follows, quotes, "The risks are evidently very considerable, the rewards slight and inconstant, and it is perhaps time that the treatment was relegated to the histories of psychiatry."
As Barry Hart said earlier, he spent 7 years trying to get someone to believe his story. Lawyers, doctors and politicians wouldn't listen. The man who has ultimate responsibility for policing medical practices in New South Wales is the Health Minister, Mr. Kevin Stewart. He wouldn't listen either. Then there's a letter from Mr. Stewart, the New South Wales Minister for Health.
Yeah, that's right, Kevin Stewart.
And he told you he couldn't do anything about it.
Well, he wasn't very interested, that's for sure.
Mr. Stewart wasn't the only New South Wales Cabinet Minister who had received complaints. The Attorney-General, Mr. Frank Walker, also received complaints from a lobby group calling itself the Citizens Committee for Human Rights. Mr. Walker asked Mr. Stewart what he was going to do about the complaints. In this letter, Mr. Stewart promised there would be a full investigation. That was in November 1978, 2 years ago. Nothing has been done. Mr. Stewart refused to talk to us about the subject. Dr. Heron and Dr. Bailey would not talk to us either. As you've seen, narcosis is not just an unusual and very controversial form of treatment, it's also a very risky one. For that reason alone, you'd expect doctors using it to stick to the most scrupulous standards when it came to prescribing the large dosages of drugs required. That wasn't the case at Chelmsford. This is a treatment sheet with the list of drugs normally given for narcosis. There is no patient's name, no date, yet it has already been signed by Dr. Bailey. Another treatment sheet, this time with no list of drugs, no patient's name, no date, yet once again already signed by Dr. Bailey. In other words, these treatment sheets could have been used on anyone. And there were other questionable practices. For example, not only giving shock treatment to patients without their consent, but as former matron Marcia Nast recalls, sometimes when the patient positively refused to have it. Would you be surprised to learn that there were patients at Chelmsford who specifically said that they didn't want ECT and were given ECT?
Would I be surprised? Yeah, no, that's happened.
That's happened?
Yeah.
We could only get our hands on a few of the records from Chelmsford Hospital, but there's no question that narcosis was used for about 15 years. The hospital wouldn't let us see the files on narcosis patients or the death register. But in spite of that, we discovered that at least 7 people died in a short period of time. What happened in all those other years, we just don't know.
What makes me very angry is the fact that the doctors who knew about Chelmsford Hospital, who refused to speak out about it, the politicians who knew what was going on up there, who refused to talk about it, speak out about it, the members of the legal profession who knew what was going on up there and refused to speak out about it, the people who have suffered since I started my action back in 1973, people who suffered brain damage, the people who have been turned into vegetables because nobody was prepared to do something about it. What I'd like to say to those people is, how do those people justify their existence?
Hello, I'm Liam Bartlett. Thanks for watching. To keep up with the latest from 60 Minutes Australia, make sure you subscribe to our channel. You can also download the 9Now app for full episodes and other exclusive 60 Minutes content.